A cryptic note in blue ink, and a vanished suspect. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments mean the world to me. I always love reading them. Let's dive in. It was late in the afternoon, the kind of Parisian winter day when the dampness seemed to cling to your coat even indoors. Maigret sat at his desk in the Quai des Orfèvres, not with a file before him, but with his pipe, which had gone cold some 20 minutes earlier. He hadn't bothered to relight it. His eyes were fixed not on the papers, but on the condensation that streaked the window pane, tracing lines as crooked as the streets below. He had promised Louise that he would be home in time for dinner, and she had promised a pot-au-feu that was already simmering. He could almost smell it, rich and steady. Something certain in a day filled with uncertainties. A telephone rang in another office, shrill and indifferent, followed by the uneven footsteps of Lognon, muttering as always. The office smelled faintly of wet wool. Maigret rose at last, tugged on his overcoat and made his way out into the street. The rain had slackened, but the cobblestones were slick, reflecting gas lamps and neon in a way that made the city seem at once familiar and oddly distant. He walked slowly, shoulders hunched toward the metro, though he had no real hurry in him. He liked these half hours between his work and his home, where he could be simply a man among others, breathing the same damp air, noticing the same small miseries of Paris. Near Boulevard Saint-Germain, he stopped to buy matches. The kiosk keeper, a man with a red scarf pulled tight around his throat, handed him the box with a nod, then hesitated. He had the look of someone about to speak, and then thinking better of it. Maigret lit his pipe and gave him a small, encouraging glance. The man leaned a little forward. "Inspector, you haven't heard. They found a woman this morning in one of the furnished rooms on Rue du Chemin Vert. Nothing unusual, except a note she left behind. It wasn't signed, but they say it was written in blue ink, neat as a schoolteacher's hand." He paused, uncertain, as though realizing he might have said too much. "They say it doesn't match her own writing at all." Maigret puffed once, then twice, the smoke curling lazily in the damp air. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He only gave the man a nod, and the man, relieved, busied himself with arranging newspapers. A woman brushed past, her umbrella dripping, and the moment broke. He stood there a little longer, watching the drizzle blur the outlines of passing faces. A note written in blue ink. A room on Rue du Chemin Vert. Nothing official, not yet. But it was the kind of small offhand thing that tugged at him, the way an unfamiliar scent in his own house might. He could already picture the room, wallpaper peeling at the corners, a single light bulb dangling, and someone, some ordinary someone, who had lived a life no one had really noticed until it ended. Maigret tucked the matchbox into his pocket, adjusted his coat, and set off again through the wet streets. He would be late to dinner, after all. Louise would scold him gently, but she would understand. It was never the dramatic crimes that caught him by the throat. It was the little ones, the ordinary rooms, the ordinary notes, that spoke of loneliness, of secrets kept too long. And already, without meaning to, he was listening for the silence behind that note in blue. He found a telephone box near the metro and stood, with the receiver pressed to his ear, while a thin stream of rain traced its way down his hat brim and onto his collar. Louise answered on the second ring, her voice warm, already resigned. He told her not to wait. He tried to make it sound casual, a detour, nothing urgent. She said the pot-au-feu would keep, and to be careful not to catch cold. When he hung up, he stood a second longer, looking at his reflection blurred by the damp glass, a heavy man in an old coat, and then he set off toward Rue du Chemin Vert with the kind of patience that had become his gait. The building had a courtyard that smelled of soap and boiled cabbage, with a canopy of laundry limp from the weather. A single gas lamp burned in the entryway, haloed by the fine drizzle that drifted in through the half-open door. He saw at once the kind of place it was, a house where sound carried easily through the plaster, where a cough in one room drew a cough in another, where footsteps on the stair made nervous people pause in the very act of breathing. He rang not the bell to the third floor, but at the concierge's lodge. Madame Borel appeared with a dish towel over one shoulder, a stout woman in a wool cardigan, hair coiled under a net the color of cigarette smoke. She peered up at him through steel-rimmed spectacles, uncertain until he said his name. Then her shoulders sank with both relief and the small vindication of having something worth telling. "I didn't mean to make a fuss," she began, yet all of her seemed prepared to do precisely that. It was the girl in the third left-hand side. Quiet, always paid on the dot. "This morning I took the milk and there was no sound." "The door was not locked, Inspector, imagine!" And then the note on the table there in blue ink, laid out as if for a photograph. "Who called the police?" he asked. "I did." "It's my duty, isn't it?" A flicker of pride. The men from the commissariat came and went. "A doctor, too." "Pills," he said. They took their notes. "She's still there." They said, "Well, one of them said it's simple enough that these things happen to young women alone." "And her name?" "Claire Moreau. At least that's what it says on the rent receipts. Worked by the day for a dressmaker on Rue Oberkampf. She wasn't one for conversation." He followed Madame Borel into the corridor, which narrowed as it climbed, and then up the stairs. Each landing smelled of a different house, coal dust and onions on the first, hair tonic and floor polish on the second. On the third, the air had a faint sweetness, the kind that clings to old perfume bottles even when they're empty. A uniformed officer stood outside 3 Gauche. He was young enough to blush at the sight of Maigret, and to stand a little straighter. "Everything as you found it?" Maigret asked, his voice without edge. "Yes, Chief." The boy swallowed. "The doctor's been." He said, "Sleeping pills." "There's the note." The room was small and square, furnished like a line of copy in a catalogue. Iron bed with a wool throw, a narrow table, 2 chairs, a wardrobe with a mirror that had long ago given up the idea of flattery. The window was shut, but beads of moisture filmed the glass from within. On the floor beside the bed were a pair of shoes, plain black ones, recently polished to a dull shine, and it was this, almost more than the shape under the wool throw. That made Maigret slow his step. He didn't look at the bed at first. He let the room introduce itself. A chipped blue saucer on the table held the heel of bread and the ghost of a coffee ring. The ashtray was empty and clean. He would have believed it had never been used, if not for the very faint scent of tobacco threaded through the heavier smell of the wool throw. On the chair back hung a dark coat, cheap but well cared for, its cuffs let down and re-hemmed. By the stove a matchbox lay open, and beside it a pencil stub squared by use. There was no pen in sight. He turned to the note. It had been placed precisely at the table's center, as though someone had measured the distance to the edges with their eyes. The blue ink was indeed neat, the lines level, the letters compact and self-conscious, with the little self-importance of schoolbook script. He read it once and then again, not for its meaning, there was almost none, but for the weight of the hand that had pressed the nib to the paper. "I am tired," it said. "Forgive me. It is nobody's fault." There was no signature. At the end of the final line, a dot sat a shade darker, as if the pen had paused there and the ink had pooled. He stood a long moment, feeling the pipe heavy in his pocket, wanting and not wanting to draw it out. Then he looked at the bed. The doctor had covered the woman's face. One arm lay on top of the wool narrow wrist, fine fingers with the dry remnants of some transparent polish. No dramatic tableau, just a body that had stopped being anything else. On the bedside table were 2 things, a cheap alarm clock with a hairline crack in the glass, and a small tin once filled with pastilles. It was empty. He lifted it and put it down again. "Did anyone touch the note?" he asked, not expecting an answer that would please him. The commissariat man read it, the young officer said, abashed. He put it back where he found it. "And the neighbors?" At the question, Madame Borel reappeared unbidden in the doorway, drawn as if by a string. "Mademoiselle in 3 Droite went to her sister's last night and hasn't returned. The man on the second is at work, post office. I knocked at 3 Fond this morning. The door was closed, but I heard the radio. People keep to themselves, Inspector. It's not like it was. It's not like it was. It's not." Maigret crossed to the wardrobe and opened it. 3 dresses, one on a wire hanger that had lost its paper collar, a faint line of blue chalk on the hem of one, the habitude of a seamstress's fittings. On the wardrobe floor, a shoebox held a roll of ribbon, a postcard from somewhere on the coast, where the sky was always better than in Paris, and a folded scrap of paper that had once wrapped a sandwich. He saw nothing that explained anything. He stood very still and let the room's stubborn silence press against him. "Is there a pen?" he asked the room as if it might answer. The young officer began to look automatically, and then stopped, embarrassed by his own eagerness. Maigret's gaze went from the clean ashtray to the pencil stub, to the note with its neat blue certainty. He placed a fingertip near the edge of the paper. not touching it, feeling instead the old habit of offices, the way a blotter remembers hands, the way paper settles where it is used. He imagined the writer sitting here, aligning the sheet, keeping their sleeve off the table, minding the ink. She wrote in pencil, Madame Borel said suddenly, her voice soft, as if she had been speaking in her head for some time and had only now realized she'd said it aloud. When she left her rent under the door, it was always pencil. Round letters, a little anxious. This, she did not complete the thought. He nodded without looking at her. He went to the window and unlatched it. The rain made a sound like sighing as the pane tilted. The courtyard's laundry stirred. He leaned out a little. The sill was damp, but the inner frame was dry. He straightened the window again and closed it. "Who has keys?" he asked. "Only me and the tenants. I do not lend." There was affront in her voice, but beneath it a pulse of worry. Houses like this had histories, and each incident added a weight that concierges felt in their bones. He took a last slow look. The shoes under the bed were too clean for the weather. Clothes laid out with a care that wasn't quite personal, more like a carefulness meant to be seen. No pen, a neat note in blue ink. A body that had the courtesy to lie still. It could have been simple. It could have been the quiet catastrophe of a life becoming too heavy. He did not believe it. "Not yet. Leave the door as it is," he said. "I'll speak with the neighbors when they return." He nodded to the young officer, a reassurance, and to Madame Borel, who sought in his face either doom or relief and found neither. Back in the corridor, he listened to the building as one listens to a shell from the sea. His hands sunk deep into his coat pockets, the pipe shifting against his fingers. Footsteps from a floor below, the sudden hush of a radio being turned down, the cough of a man who didn't want to be heard. He descended a single step and then stopped, as if the stair itself had told him to wait. He was good at waiting. It was a kind of listening. At length he went back down to the lodge, asked for a chair, and sat by the door where the rain made fine beads on the threshold. He would let the house speak in its own time. Upstairs on the table, the blue note waited with a patience that felt almost like a challenge. He stayed by the door long enough for the light to change its mind about evening. The courtyard took on that leaden hue that made damp stone seem older. The lodge smelled of cabbage cooling now, and of the cheap soap in the tin dish by the tap. Madame Borel made coffee in a dented pot without asking, set a cup near his elbow, and sat again with her hands folded over a cardigan button as if to keep from speaking. He didn't touch the cup. Footsteps in the passage came and went. A boy tugged a bicycle with a flat tire. Someone laughed too loudly, and then stopped when they saw him. The first tenant back was the post office man from the second floor, umbrella under his arm, a parcel tucked against his chest. He had a thin neck and a careful walk, the manner of a man who lives by other people's schedules. His key was already in his hand, but he paused when Madame Borel called his name, and inclined her head toward Maigret. "This is Monsieur Vacheron," she announced, with the ceremonial disapproval concierges reserve for tenants who might have done something without knowing it. "The inspector has questions." Vacheron shifted the parcel and tried to smile. "If it's about the girl upstairs, terrible business. The policeman this morning said, well, they said there's nothing to be done." "Did you know her?" Maigret asked, "only to say bonjour on the stairs. We kept to ourselves." He looked at the umbrella tip, at the tiles, anywhere but at Maigret. There was a crescent of blue along his right forefinger, just at the nail, the kind of stain a man doesn't quite manage to scrub away. In his jacket pocket, a darker blue marked the cloth where a pen had leaked more than once. He followed Maigret's gaze and offered the little shrug of someone forced to explain his profession. "At the counter we sign things all day. The nibs are no good." "You were out when she was found," Maigret said. "It was not a question. I leave at 6. I return when there's work to be had." Another glance, a measuring look now. "Is it true there was a note?" "There was. In blue ink, they said." He attempted a weak smile at his own fingers. "They will say it's me. People will say anything." Maigret didn't answer. He let the silence sit between them long enough that Vacheron felt its weight. "I didn't lend her a pen, if that's what you want to know," he said at last. "I never went in. I saw her once in the corridor late, with a parcel from a drapery house, I think. She had the air of someone who does not want to be stopped in the passage. That is all." "You hear things, Monsieur Vacheron," Maigret said mildly. "On the second, sound must travel up and down very well." "Last night?" Vacheron pursed his lips, then nodded. Around 11, footsteps, slow then quick again. A man's cough, not old, not young. It is not much. I turned down my radio. There was the tap running for a time. Madame Borel complains about the meter, so we all mind the taps. He attempted a smile toward the lodge, which found no purchase. Thank you, Maigret said, as if someone had delivered exactly what was ordered. Vacheron seized his key, grateful to be dismissed, and disappeared up the stair with the careful tread that belonged to him. The next one was from the third, the room at the back where the radio had been at once too loud and too cautious. A man in his 30s with a thin moustache and a suit made to last. He carried a bag of onions and a copy of L'Intransigeant folded under his arm. He paused at the sight of Maigret and removed his hat with more ceremony than was needed. Chabot, Madame Borel supplied. He tinkers with adding machines, Inspector. Mademoiselle Moreau, Chabot said, nodding toward the ceiling, and then letting the sentence trail off. His eyes slid away. We are not close here. People come and go. Did she have visitors? Maigret asked. I am not a concierge, Chabot said with a faint attempt at humor that died at once under Madame Borel's gaze. Once, perhaps twice, in the last month, a man with a mackintosh, galoshes. I noticed because he did not drum mud on the stair the way most do. He had the careful way of placing feet that people have when they are not used to our steps. Foreigners do that, or people from the better streets. He looked apologetic suddenly, as if he had introduced a vulgarity. And last night, Maigret's voice was even. He had not moved since he sat. The radio was on mine. I turned it down around 10. After that, the tap, yes, as Monsieur Vacheron says. And a smell. He frowned at himself. Not flowers. The man's. The sort one buys at Christmas because one does not know what else to give. It is nothing. I am imagining. Did she smoke? Maigret asked. I never smelled it from her, Chabot said. From me, yes, I am sorry, he added to Madame Borel, who sniffed. But not from her. This morning the corridor had that end of cigarette smell, the last 2 centimeters. Perhaps the policeman. He grimaced, aware it was unlikely. When he had gone, carrying his onions as if they might change the balance of his life by scent alone, the house seemed to hesitate. Rain fretted the threshold. Somewhere above, a lazy foot dragged in sleep. Then the bell at the front door rasped once, and in came a young woman in a worn coat with a small suitcase, hair that had lost its curled resolve in the damp, cheeks chafed pink. She stopped short at the sight of the uniformed officer in the hall, and looked at Maigret as if expecting the part he would play in her day, and hoping it was the smaller part. Is it Claire? She asked, as if the name could be softened by how it was said. Mademoiselle Vernier, Madame Borel said softly, drawing her in. Droite droite. Maigret rose then, slowly, and his chair made a small honest noise on the tiles. I am very sorry, he said. She was good, the young woman said. That was all at first. She stood with one hand on the suitcase handle, as if to keep from sliding away. We shared a kettle. We shared the newspapers. She read the weather. I read the adverts. She wrote her lists in pencil on the margins and left them under the sugar tin. Always pencil. She did not like ink. It smudges, she said. She said it makes things seem too sure. Did she own a pen? Maigret asked. I would have borrowed it, Lisa said simply. She put the suitcase down and unbuttoned her coat with clumsy fingers, as if each button had become unfamiliar. She asked me once if I could lend her a stamp. I gave her 2, and she said she would pay me when she had change. She kept her money in a tobacco tin. If she had used a pen, it would have been at the dressmaker's. They have forms. Visitors. I never saw any. I heard a man once in the corridor, but he spoke softly, and she always spoke softly, so I could not tell the difference. She had the bewildered hurt of someone who has been careful all her life and finds it brought no safety. Is it true there was a note? Yes, in blue. She said the color the way people do when naming a thing that does not belong. Then it was not hers. He nodded a little. He had confirmed only what the room had already told him. Last night, he said, what time did you leave? Just after supper. My sister was ill. I took the bus and slept on her sofa. I came back now because she is better and because I forgot my... She looked at the suitcase as if it had packed itself. I did not smell smoke in our corridor at night, she added, with the sudden insistence of someone who remembers a thing and must deliver it. This morning only, when I came for my scarf. And water had run under her door, as if someone had scrubbed the floor. "Thank you," he said, not because it was over, but because he saw that to go further would only break something in her that did not need breaking. Up the stairs again. He let the house accompany him with its small noises, the shift of a chair leg, the cluck of a pipe cooling, a child's brief wail and the immediate adult hush. The room was unchanged, which is to say it had settled with the minor obstinacy of places where something has ended. He stood by the table and looked at the note a third time. The lines were too straight for someone at a kitchen table. They had the calm horizontals of paper placed on paper. On the table's varnish, just at the edge, a tiny comet smear of blue had dried to a dull grain. He rubbed it with his thumb and felt the resistance. A careless pen touched there and was lifted away. From the courtyard the bell rasped again. A step on the stair, quicker than the others, then slow, as if practiced for respect. A young man appeared in the doorway, rain still shining on the shoulders of his mackintosh, hat in his hands, his hair pressed flat. He looked first at the uniformed officer, then at the bed, and then at Maigret with a caution that had weight to it. "I'm from the atelier on Rue Oberkampf," he said. "Mademoiselle Moreau, she left a parcel to be altered. They sent me to fetch it." He held himself very still, as if any movement might spill what he was keeping inside. On his collar, barely visible until one looked for it, was the faintest shadow where a hand had wiped away a stain. His right thumbnail had a line of blue he had tried to clean and had not quite managed. "Come in," Maigret said, not moving from the table. "Close the door. Tell me your name." The young man hesitated before speaking, as if choosing whether to give his true name or a version of it better suited to the moment. His voice, when it came, was polite, almost deferential. "Lemoine, Inspector. André Lemoine. Apprentice cutter. I've been at Madame Delot's atelier for 3 years." He set his hat carefully on the chair near the door, his damp mackintosh dripping onto the worn tiles. His hands were restless, first smoothing the brim of the hat, then finding his pockets empty, then folding together, as though they might betray him if he let them wander too freely. Maigret regarded him without speaking. It was the kind of look that settled over a person, not demanding but patient, the weight of silence encouraging words to fill it. Lemoine shifted, coughed lightly, then went on. "I didn't know her well. Mademoiselle Moreau, I mean. She worked with Madame in the afternoons, sometimes in the back rooms. I was told she left a piece for alteration, and I came to fetch it." His eyes darted briefly to the wardrobe where the chalk-marked dress still hung. "But then they said there had been an accident here. Who told you to fetch it?" Maigret asked, his voice quiet. "Madame Delot herself. This morning. She said it would be better if the work didn't sit unfinished." Maigret's pipe in his pocket pressed reassuringly against his hand. He had not lit it for hours, though the thought lingered. "And what did Madame Delot say of Claire Moreau's death?" The boy's Adam's apple moved, but no words came at once. Finally, only that it was sad. She seemed surprised, but then, "Not entirely. I don't know. Forgive me, Inspector, I'm not clever with these things." "Yet you came at once," Maigret murmured. "Yes, it seemed my duty. To help." His gaze slid again toward the dress in the wardrobe. Maigret let it rest there, noticing the faint line of blue at his thumbnail, the trace he had tried to hide. He didn't confront him with it, not yet. Instead, he asked, "Did you ever lend her a pen?" The boy's head came up sharply, too quickly, and then just as quickly down again. "A pen? No, why would I? I mean, we write in pencil in the atelier." "Madame insists." "Ink stains cloth, yet you have blue on your fingers," Lemoine's breath caught. He rubbed his hands together, as though to erase the mark by will alone. It was my own carelessness. I wrote a list for the delivery man, and the pen leaked. I've tried to clean it, but—" His words tangled, then fell silent. Maigret stood and crossed to the wardrobe, sliding the dress free. It was a simple garment, meant for wear rather than display, chalk marks at the hem and waist. He held it out. "This?" "Yes," Lemoine said at once, his relief too hasty, too complete. "That's the one. Madame will want it finished. She said to bring it." "Of course." Maigret folded it back, placed it where it had been, and turned to face him again. "And last night? Where were you?" The boy's mouth opened, closed. He cleared his throat. "At home, Rue Amelot. My mother was ill. I stayed in, with witnesses." His shoulders slumped. "Only her. She would tell you I never left. But perhaps she would say it too eagerly, because she worries for me." His eyes were large, earnest but flickering, too many truths or too many lies. Maigret couldn't yet tell. He let the silence spool out again. Rain tapped at the window pane. Somewhere below, a kettle whistled and was snatched off its flame. Lemoine's breathing grew audible, thin in the heavy air. "You knew her better than you say," Maigret said quietly. The boy flinched. "No, Inspector. Truly, You knew her well enough to come here in the rain for a dress your mistress did not urgently need. Well enough to look not at the body but at her wardrobe. Well enough that the sight of this room makes your hands shake." Lemoine's lips parted. For a moment it seemed he would protest again, but the words dried in his mouth. His gaze fell to the note on the table, lingered there with a guilty fascination. "They say she left that?" "They say." He approached the table, careful steps as if the note itself might recoil. His eyes moved over the lines. "She didn't write like that. You've seen her hand?" "On the forms. On the little scraps she kept in her pockets. Round, soft, not this. This is rigid, like someone learning their letters." His voice faltered. "It wasn't her." Maigret watched him closely. "And yet you seem sure of it, though you claim you hardly knew her." The boy flushed, eyes lowering. He seemed about to speak, then clenched his jaw. "Inspector, I have to take the dress." He reached as if to move past, but Maigret's bulk in the narrow room made the gesture absurd. "You will take nothing tonight," Maigret said, not unkindly. "Go home to your mother. Tell her the inspector may wish to speak with her tomorrow." Lemoine hesitated, then collected his hat with clumsy fingers, his eyes darting once more toward the note before he turned. When the door closed behind him, the silence thickened again as though the room had swallowed his presence without satisfaction. The young officer by the wall shifted. "Shall I follow him, Chief?" "Not yet." Maigret moved to the window, opened it a fraction. The air smelled of wet stone and cabbage smoke. He filled his lungs, exhaled slowly. "He will come back of his own accord. People like that cannot keep still when their hearts are stirring." He looked again at the shoes by the bed, polished bright against the weather. A boy with ink-stained hands, a note written too carefully, neighbors who smelled smoke and water running, pieces that refused yet to settle, but already tugged toward one another. He pulled the pipe from his pocket at last, thumbed the bowl though he did not light it. His eyes lingered on the little dot of ink at the end of the note, darker than the rest where the pen had hesitated. It was in such hesitations he knew that truths revealed themselves. He closed the window, nodded to the officer, and stepped out into the corridor. The house breathed around him in muffled coughs and whispered radios. He would go home now to Louise and her pot-au-feu, and he would sit across from her in the quiet kitchen. She would ask nothing, and yet perhaps in her talk of trifles, a neighbor's niece, the price of onions, something would settle in his mind. For in silence and in the most ordinary remarks, the weight of truth had a way of surfacing, and as he pulled on his coat and stepped into the damp street, Maigret thought not of death nor of guilt, but of the stubborn little fact of blue ink, clinging to fingers, to paper, to the air itself, refusing to be erased. The streets had that tired look Paris wore after a day of rain, lamps reflected in puddles that stretched like long mirrors along the gutters. Maigret walked slowly, shoulders bent forward, his hat brim dripping. He wasn't in a hurry to reach home, though he knew Louise would have kept the pot-au-feu warm, the smell of it filling their kitchen. He was thinking of ink stains, on a boy's fingers, on a scrap of paper, on the edge of a table. He thought, too, of shoes that shone when they ought to have been dulled by mud, of water running too long in a basin, of a note that claimed to speak for a woman's despair, yet sounded like the voice of a stranger. At home, Louise looked up from her knitting with a smile that was part reproach, part welcome. She set the pot back on the flame, ladled broth into his bowl and talked of small things. The grocer's complaint about butter deliveries, the neighbor's child who had scarlet fever. He listened without answering at first, his spoon resting on the rim of the bowl. Then gently she touched his hand. "Something troubles you," she said, not as a question but as a certainty. He stirred the broth once, watching the vegetables drift. "A woman found dead in her room. They say it was her own hand, but there was a note she didn't write." Louise looked at him steadily. "People sometimes write in ways that surprise, don't they?" She didn't own a pen. Then it was someone else who wanted it to look as though she had decided. "Why?" Louise tilted her head as if considering a household chore. "Perhaps to protect themselves? Or to spare someone?" He gave a small smile, weary but affectionate. "You make it sound so simple." "It usually is. People are not so complicated, Jules. They are frightened or proud or lonely. One writes a note to hide fear. Another polishes shoes to hide shame. It is always the hiding that tells you more than the act itself. Her words sank into him, the way a single drop ripples through water. He said nothing more but finished the broth, the warmth settling his stomach though his mind still turned. Later in bed, while Louise's breathing deepened beside him, he lay awake, the faint ticking of the clock at his side marking the long rhythm of thought. He saw again the ink dot, the two neat lines, the young man's anxious eyes. Somewhere in the web of that small lodging house lay a thread that had already brushed against his fingers. The next morning was pale and dry, though the sky held the color of tin. He returned to the Rue du Chemin Vert, the concierge opening her door as if she had been waiting for the sound of his step. She had questions in her eyes but said nothing, only handed him the key to the room. He climbed slowly, stopping on the second landing where the air smelled faintly of onions and the stale trace of tobacco. In Claire Moreau's room, the note still lay on the table. It seemed almost to defy him, sitting there in its tidy confidence. He pulled out the chair, sat, and for a while did nothing but look. He imagined the hand that had written it, the pen balanced too carefully, the effort to keep the lines even. A suicide's note, if written in earnest, would carry hesitation, unevenness, the unsteadiness of a last act. This one had a steadiness that came from design, not despair. The wardrobe creaked faintly as he opened it again. The dress with the chalk mark hung where he had returned it. He touched the hem, thinking of the boy from the atelier. His nervousness had not been grief, but fear. And yet fear of what? Of being accused, or of something more binding? A knock at the open door made him turn. It was Inspector Lognon, the eternal mourner of the brigade, his face longer than usual, as though he had been forced to climb the stairs under protest. "You've taken an interest, Chief?" he asked, tone half resentful, half relieved. Maigret inclined his head. "They called it simple. Pills and a note, but nothing about it feels simple," Lognon grunted. The doctor signed off. "No bruises, no struggle. She did not write the note." The other man blinked, frowned. "How do you know?" "Because her neighbor has seen her writing. Because her concierge has... Because she owned no pen. And because this," he tapped the paper with his thick finger, "was written as if by someone teaching himself how to write neatly. It is too careful. Despair is rarely tidy." Lognon sighed, shifted his feet. "You'll make trouble for yourself. The magistrate wants it filed away." Maigret lit his pipe at last, filling the room with its sweet, heavy smoke. "Then he may wait a little longer. Trouble, Lognon, is the only way to find out why a woman who polished her shoes and folded her coat neatly was found with a note in a hand that was not her own." They went down together, the old stairs creaking under their weight. In the courtyard, Madame Borel was hanging laundry, her eyes darting toward them. Maigret asked, "Did she receive letters?" The concierge shook her head. "Never. Not once in the year she was here. She sent a few, perhaps, but only small ones, and always with stamps borrowed from Lise." Maigret nodded. Then who would use ink for her words, when her own habit was pencil? He left the question to dangle like washing in the cold air. Later, walking back along Boulevard Voltaire, he found himself among the mourning workers, men with bread under their arms, women with scarves tied against the chill. All ordinary, all carrying secrets so small they would never reach a police file. But sometimes one secret grew heavy enough to topple a life. He stopped at a cafe, ordered coffee he barely touched, and sat by the window. He thought of Lemoine, the apprentice, his anxious eyes darting to the wardrobe. A boy too nervous to kill, or too nervous to hide what he had seen another do. Perhaps the atelier held the thread Louise had spoken of. People did not live in isolation. Even the quietest lives brushed against others. Somewhere in those small brushes lay the reason for a note written in blue ink. He rose, paid, and turned his steps toward Rue Oberkampf. The atelier would be opening, the seamstresses arriving with their chatter and their needle-pricked fingers. And Madame Deslot, mistress of the house, who had sent the boy for a dress before the body was yet cold. That too was a kind of ink mark, one that had seeped too quickly, too eagerly, onto the fabric of the story. As he walked, the city seemed to watch him with its damp grey eyes, each doorway holding its own silence, each window the shadow of someone peering out. The case was no longer the death of a quiet girl in a rented room. It was becoming the story of the small lies that cling to ordinary lives until they tangle together into something darker. Herrn Maigret, with his heavy coat and his pipe unlit, felt the weight of it settle, certain now that the note in blue ink was only the beginning. Rue Oberkampf was waking up in its own way, shutters lifted halfway like eyelids not yet decided on the day. The atelier stood behind fogged glass, a narrow doorway with a brass bell that rang with a tired brightness as he pushed in. Warmth met him, and with it the mild, scorched smell of a steam iron, chalk dust and wool, a domestic heat that seeped into his coat and made his shoulders loosen without his noticing. Mannequins peered from corners like patient sentries. A woman at a machine paused with her foot suspended on the treadle, thread taut between fingers. Another, older, held a thimble as if it were a token of office. Their eyes slid to him and away again, as if politeness were a curtain drawn and redrawn. A small figure appeared from a back room, her tape measure already looped neatly about her neck. Madame Delot was 60 if a day, trim without being severe, lips painted too perfectly for so early an hour. She had the assured hands of one who has told fabric what to do for a lifetime. "Inspector," she said without surprise, "if it's about poor Claire, we have heard. Claire, we have heard. Claire." He took off his hat and let the bell jingle shut behind him. "It is about Claire. I won't take your time more than I must. Time is thread, Inspector. One breaks if pulled too long." The ghost of a smile. "Come to the office. The air is warmer there." She led him through a corridor of hanging garments to a small room where a ledge served as a desk. A black stove ticked faintly. On the ledge lay a blotter, a ledger open to a ruled page, a paperweight in the shape of a brass pear. A fountain pen rested in a shallow dish near a saucer, with a lace-like coffee stain. The pen's cap was off. The nib bore a blue shadow at its edges, like a bird's feather dipped too often. "We were fond of her," Madame Delot said, lowering herself into a chair that had learned the shape of her back. A quiet girl. Good hands, slow but reliable. She didn't chatter. She worked afternoons, Maigret said, not sitting yet, sometimes in the back rooms. Mostly hems, finishing, a little pressing when my Roussel had her nerves. Madame Delot sighed, not for sentiment, but for the administration of people. Claire was grateful for work that did not talk back to her. "Did she have friends among your girls?" "Girls make friends with ease they do not keep," Madame Delot said. "They are kind and then they forget to be kind." Claire needed little. She had pride. She would not be pitied. Visitors here. For her. Madame Delot's hand made a small dismissive movement. Clients sometimes spoke to whoever carried their parcel. But no one came asking for Claire. She was not a creature men look for. He let the words rest. "You sent a boy to fetch a dress this morning." "I did. No apology." "The work should not sit, Inspector. It goes stale like pastry. And clients are like cats. They do not forgive being kept waiting." "Why André Lemoine?" "Because he has legs and will do as he is told." A thin smile again, then a look that took him in more fully. "He is a willing boy, clumsy with people, good with cloth, lives with his mother. The sort who believes being useful is a kind of protection. Was he attentive to Claire?" She considered, eyes traveling to the slit of light between blind and frame. He carried parcels for all of them. He would carry the world if a woman asked him twice. Too eager, perhaps. He'd make some women kind and others careless. On the blotter, a little trumpet-shaped smear of blue had dried at the edge, where a pen lifted too late. He leaned as if to rest a hand, and the paper released the faint mineral smell of ink. "You keep a pen," he said. "In an atelier you insist on pencil, I was told." "In the workrooms, yes." She tapped the ledger with 2 fingers. "In the office, no. The accountant likes things to look proper." "Blue is proper. The accountant. My brother-in-law comes twice a week." She plucked the pen up, wiped its nib with a square of muslin already stained in a constellation of blue dots. "Today is not one of those days." He looked at the open page. The neat columns did not seek to hide. "May I?" She inclined her head, resigned. He scanned the names, advances and balances, small amounts that had the meanness of adding up. "Claire Moreau," he read. "Last week in advance, 80 francs. Before that, smaller sums, regular as breath." She was short. Who is not? Madame Delot said without self-pity. "Rent is tall. Meat is dear." She did piecework for a client sometimes. Madame Canel, near Parmentier. I looked away. It keeps the hands from idleness. Madame Canel paid in cash? I do not ask how other women manage their purses. He set the ledger down. Last evening, what time did Claire leave here? Just before 7. I remember because the iron was still hissing, and she was careful to step around the cord. She had a parcel to mend at home. Tell him that would not listen. Madame Delot's mouth twitched. She did not much care for hems that argued. She wore the dark coat, no hat, and Lemoine, left later. We finished a fitting with a difficult lady who wanted to be younger. He carried a box to the corner. He brought back the tape I had forgotten in the pocket. Then he went. He has an honest face, Inspector, but honest faces can be frightened into foolishness. Who uses your pen? Me and the accountant. Sometimes, if I am called to the front, Roussel writes a receipt. Why? She asked it with curiosity, not fear, as if he had inquired about her needle sizes. There was a note, he said, and watched the small muscles in her jaw. In blue. She did not flinch, but something in her set more firmly. Ah, a thoughtful sound. Blue does not make a thing true. No, but hands make habits. A woman who writes in pencil because ink smudges. A shop that keeps its blue for ledgers. They leave traces. She held the pen out by its cap almost primly. This is a Waterman. It leaks if one is careless. It puts a dot at the end of sentences if one pauses. I have asked for a new nib, but the accountant says a dot is not a crime. She smiled, a dry professional thing. Do you think my pen killed your girl? He took the pen, weighed it, wrote his name on the blotter as if testing a fabric's hand. The ink pooled very slightly where the nib slowed. He recognized the look of it, the tiny darkness heavier than the line that led to it. He replaced the pen. I think your pen is like all tools. It tells the truth about the hand that uses it. Perhaps you should ask the post office for their pens, she said lightly. Their fingers are always blue. A harmless remark, but his mind saw Vacheron's stained forefinger against the parcel he held like a small shield. He asked for Claire's file, and Madame Delot produced a stiff pocket with her time cards and a paper with her address written in a round pencil hand, soft, a little anxious. A scrap of paper fell free, a shopping list in the same roundness, thread, soap, bread, matches, pencil, no ink. He returned them gently. When you heard of her death, he said, you sent the boy at once. I did. No retreat. Sorrow should not crease what must be delivered. Did he know where she lived? Of course. He has fetched and carried for half the courtier. She paused then, and for the first time looked not at him but at the door, as if it might have ears. Inspector, whatever you think, André is not a bad boy. He is easily led by his feelings. That is not the same as harm. He nodded as if they had agreed on the shape of the world. In the workroom he stood a moment, listening to needles through cloth, the mild hiss of steam, the way women's talk flattened when men stood too near. On a wall hook hung a mackintosh with a fraying belt, a man's, but it was old and had chalk on its sleeve. He brushed it. The chalk came away on his finger like tired snow. At the door, Madame Delot offered him his hat. Will there be trouble? She asked as if asking about weather. There is already trouble, he said. It is only whether we choose to notice it. Back on the pavement, the air had thinned. Across the street, a boy loitered by a newsstand, pretending to read the headlines with the hunger of someone who cannot keep still. When he realized he was seen, he turned away too quickly, a movement that belonged to André Lemoine, whether or not it was him. Maigret did not follow. He felt the case settling by grains. A ledger's blue, a neighbor's cologne, water running too long, shoes too clean. Money, pride, and the foolishness of hearts. He turned toward Rue Amelot with his collar up, not yet to confront, only to look at a staircase, a mother's kitchen, a boy's habits. In such kitchens, secrets were kept in the same tins as sugar and thread. They could be found if one sat long enough and spoke of nothing at all. Rue Amelot was a line of tired facades with courtyards that smelled of damp coal and warm bread. The number he wanted had a passage like a throat, the cobbles shining, a bicycle leaning against a wall as if it had given up getting anywhere. He climbed to the second floor where the paint had been rubbed thin on the banister by hands like his. A door stood ajar to let out steam and the smell of chicory. He knocked and pushed at once. The door yielded without argument. Madame Lemoine was small and square, with an apron over a dark dress and a face set in lines that would not go away even when she smiled. She held a spoon in her hand and looked at him, as if waiting to be told whether to add salt. He said his name and she nodded, as if confirming a suspicion she had been nursing since dawn. "You've come about, André," she said without opening the sentence for disagreement. "He is a good boy." Maigret took off his hat and let the heat curl around his ears. The kitchen was neat, with the domestic neatness that comes of making do, a table polished by elbows, a stove that ticked, a calendar with saints, and a picture of a cow in a field that no longer existed anywhere near here. On a chair by the door stood a pair of rubber galoshes turned neatly together, and by the sink a rag hung to dry, its corner stained a dull, inky blue. "He is a good boy," she repeated, stirring the pot as if the stew might lose courage if she stopped. "He brings his pay to me, and I give him back what he needs. He does not drink. He does not stand in the street. If he is late because work keeps him. And last night," Maigret sat without being asked, the chair creaking in a friendly way. He looked at the galoshes, the rag, the little bottle on the shelf labeled Eau de Cologne, with a paper label furred from handling. The room smelled faintly of it beneath the chicory and soap. "Last night," she said, using the spoon now to point at the clock as if it could be persuaded to testify, "he came home at 7:15. He ate the soup. He said he had to go back to the Quartier for an errand Madame had forgotten. He's a good boy. He goes when they whistle." He put on his coat. He was not gone long. Before the bell of Saint-Ambroise, I think. He came in then and coughed as if the rain had found his throat, so I made him take a spoon of syrup. She turned, opened a cupboard, showed him a bottle with a pharmacy label, brown glass, viscous as patience. "Later," she added, "he went down again to fetch me bread because I had forgotten for the morning. It is this age one forgets. He is a good boy." Maigret's pipe was in his pocket, his fingers around it, not for the tobacco but because it was heavy and accustomed to being held. "What time did he come the second time?" She frowned at the clock as if it had betrayed her. "Later. The radio in the neighbor's room had finished its dance music. Perhaps 10:30. He took off his galoshes so carefully that I did not hear him until the cough. He polished his shoes before bed on a cloth." She gestured toward a drawer. "He likes to look neat. His father was a man of mud. It is not a sin for the sun to want to shine." "He put cologne," she said, with a kind of stern tenderness, nodding at the bottle, "because a young man must not smell of glue and chalk when he walks in the evening." "The cologne was a gift?" Maigret asked. "For Noel, from me. The woman at the cooperative said it was proper for a boy. It is not expensive, but it is decent." Her eyes dared him to disagree. He glanced at the rag by the sink. "And the blue?" She followed his look and made a face. "Ink. His pen leaks. I tell him to throw it, but he says a man ought to sign with ink when he takes a parcel or writes a receipt. He comes home with fingers like a schoolboy. I wash. It does not leave." She took a pen from a cup near the calendar and placed it on the table with the firmness of a woman who presents the truth and lets others choke on it if they must. It was a cheap fountain pen with a crack in the cap, its nib a little bent. The feed stained the same blue as the rag. "You see? He keeps his papers there." She nodded at a drawer which held a notebook with pencil lists and a couple of envelopes, addressed in a round, hesitant hand that tried to be neat and did not quite succeed. The ink, where the nib had paused, had made tiny, heavier dots at the ends of words. Maigret wrote the number of the house in the corner of a scrap and saw the same little pooling. He put the pen back where it had been. Did he know Mademoiselle Moreau well? Madame Lemoine set the spoon down finally and sat opposite him, as if a council had been declared. He spoke of her, not as men speak when they boast, as one speaks of someone one hopes to help. He said she was good with her hands and two alone. He is like that. He sees a stray dog and wants to feed it. But he is not a fool, Inspector. He knows his place. He would stand under her window rather than knock if he thought it would frighten her. You said he coughed when he came in. He always coughs when he comes in from the rain, she said, with the irritation of love. He is too proud to wear a scarf. I bought one. He leaves it hanging there. She pointed to a red wool scarf on a peg, dry and unused. There was a careful tread on the stair, then a hesitation, then the door nudged and André stood there, hat in his hand again as if he had learned this movement and would not unlearn it. He saw Maigret and his face arranged itself for truth, and then found it could not carry all of it. His eyes went to the galoshes, the rag, the pen, as if each were a witness he had forgotten to square with. "You were at the atelier," Maigret said, not asking. "I went to say I would be late," André said. "Madame does not like surprises." He took in a breath that had the tremble of a boy who has slept badly. "I thought you might come here. Sit then." Maigret nudged the chair with a knee. "We will not spend words like coins. Last night you went out twice." André looked at his mother, who put her hands in her lap and stared at them. He sat. The chair made no sound. "The first time," he said, "Madame sent me after a tape she had left at a client's. I did that. The second," he swallowed, "I went by the Rue du Chemin Vert. Only by, I did not ring. The concierge will say she did not see me. I would not have woken her. I stood in the corridor and heard water. I waited. Then I coughed, and I was angry with myself because it is like tapping a spoon on a glass. I wanted to see her. Just to see. But when the water stopped, there was nothing. So I left. Why go at all?" Maigret asked. His voice was mild, which made the question sharper. "You had seen her that day. I wanted to tell her not to be afraid," he said, eyes on the table. "She had taken an advance. She did not like to owe. She said debt is the way people hold you by the sleeve. I thought—" He stopped, and the rest was a shrug that had all the clumsiness of hope. "I had the money. I was going to offer a little until the end of the week." "In ink?" Maigret said. He looked up, surprised. "You wrote something yesterday," Maigret said. "Your nails carry it. At the atelier. A receipt for a woman who wanted to leave a deposit and then changed her mind twice. Madame said to write it properly." His mouth twitched at the memory, the absurdity of clients. "The pen there is wicked. If one breathes it dots." Maigret let that lie where it fell and turned a little, so that he could look at the cologne. "You wear that when you go out late?" "Yes," André admitted, colouring. "One should not, I know, at night. It smells in the stair. But I do not want to smell of steam and chalk when I—" He stopped again, and his mother made a small sound in her throat that was neither permission nor refusal. "Did you ever lend Claire a pen?" Maigret asked. "No." He said it at once, but then slower. "We do not use pens at work. They can ruin what cannot be replaced. At home, sometimes at Madame Canel's, I would write a line for Claire, if she had her hands full with a hem. Addresses for delivery. Madame Canel is fussy. She likes everything written in blue. She says black is for funerals." "Madame Canel," Maigret repeated, as if tasting the name. "Near Parmentier," he nodded. "A little shop with curtains and perfumes and ladies who talk too loudly. She pays for piecework sometimes. She says the big houses overcharge and she has her own clients." "And men come to pay there as well?" Maigret's eyes were on the boy's hands, which wanted to move and did not dare. "Men with good hats and clean shoes," André thought, then nodded, uncertain. "A man came twice. He was not one of the husbands. He was paper, like accounts. He had galoshes that did not squeak. He liked to smell cleaner than the rest of us. He glanced, embarrassed, at the bottle on the shelf. He spoke low, like in church. Maigret got up then, heavy and without fuss. He put on his hat, the brim still faintly damp from the morning. "You will go to work," he said to André. "You will not leave Paris. You will not do anything. That makes your mother wake in the night." André's shoulders loosened a fraction, as if a sentence had been suspended and replaced with a warning. At the door, Maigret paused, looking back into the room that held its small truths without apology. The rag with its blue corner, the galoshes aligned, the bottle with the faded label. "Thank you for the chicory," he said to Madame Lemoine, though he had not drunk it. On the stairs, the light from the courtyard was the colour of old pewter. He felt the next thread present itself without drama, the way a street gives onto another. Parmentier was not far. He did not hurry. In these things, the city itself moved at a certain pace, and you learned to walk in step with it. The note in blue ink waited in its room across the river, with its neat lines and the small dark dot where a hand had hesitated. Somewhere between a ledger and a bottle of cheap cologne and a shop that liked its words in blue was the person who had taught that note how to speak. Parmentier had the resigned air of a district that had seen better hats. The shop was easy to find, a window with short curtains and a polite display of ribbons that refused to look gay under the grey light. A bell tinkled when he pushed the door. Warmth rolled out, a breath of starch, talc, and something sweet that made him think of Sunday afternoons long gone. Two women stood at the counter, comparing threads as if they were comparing daughters. They lowered their voices without being asked. Behind them, shelves of boxes wore labels written in a rounded, careful hand. Blue ink, each letter pressed a little too firmly. "Madame Canal?" he asked, though the woman who turned to him could hardly have been anyone else. She was powdered into a kind of permanence, hair piled, lips drawn on with a resolve that had survived the morning. Her hands were ringed and precise. Even her frown had a measure to it. "If it is about the girl," she said, adjusting a spool as if it had been impertinent, "I have heard. Poor thing. I paid her fare. Piecework is honest work." He removed his hat, let the bell's echo settle. "You preferred her to write in blue." "I prefer everyone to write in blue," she said with mild offense, as if he had questioned whether knives should be sharp. "Black is for bills. Blue is for life. It looks cleaner." He glanced at the counter. A waterman lay near a blotter that had been turned once, then again. The edges were scalloped with use. On a board fixed to the wall, little slips of paper were pinned under brass tacks. "Madame V. Madame Léger, buttons. Pay Friday." All in a compact, earnest script, the sort that looks at itself as it goes along. "You let Claire use your back table," he said, turning a little to see how the light fell on the noteboard. "When there was too much noise at the atelier, yes, I am not a miser with space." She worked cleanly. Some girls leave their threads like avenues. She left none. Madame Canel's mouth softened almost imperceptibly. She had respect for cloth. One sees that at once. "Who else used this counter last evening?" she considered, tapping the pen cap against the blotter with a little click that would have irritated a smaller man. "Last evening? Madame Vézine, who complains of everything in the world. The widow Hardouin. She is always in a hurry to be served slowly. And Monsieur Delambre came to leave a paper for his wife to sign. He has the notion that signatures mean something if they are written here under my eyes. He believes in order. I humor him. He pays, Delambre. He let the name find its place. He comes often? Often enough. He is from an office that believes money ought to move in little steps. Ladies who buy dresses in big steps prefer men like him to be polite. He is polite to the point of illness." She lowered her voice, though there was no need. "He wears galoshes indoors. Does he wear cologne?" Maigret asked, as if asking about the weather. Her eyes measured him. "A scent for clerks who wish to be gentlemen," she said, neither cruel nor kind. "Why?" "Her neighbor smelled cologne in a corridor where there is not usually any." "That could be any man on a damp night," she said, but she turned the blotter without knowing she had done it, then set it back the way it had been. The paper was embossed with a garden of little ovals, where pens had rested too long at their endings. On 2 or 3 spots the pressure had made a valley in the paper rather than a hill. He put a hand on the edge and smoothed it, as if it were a wrinkled sleeve. His thumb felt faint ridges under the surface lately made. "May I see your receipt book?" he asked. She fetched it without protest, because this was the kind of shop where books were kept and produced. He leafed through the duplicates. Blue lines, blue figures, little dots at the ends of words where someone had paused. Madame's hand, likely. Twice in the last week another hand appeared, more rigid, smaller, as if schooling itself to its own neatness. On a page from 3 days ago, a line read, "For hem fix pay Friday," written in that same careful blue, and beneath it initials that had the look of someone who liked to have initials. "Who wrote this?" he asked, tapping the line. "Delambre," she said without hesitation. "He is anxious that the world should know what he expects from it. He writes on my receipts as if he were placing little stones in a garden, and Claire saw him write. She would have been there, yes. She would not have minded. Men like that have no eyes for women who do not insist on being seen." He closed the book gently. "Did he ask for Claire's hours?" "He asked whether the atelier was open late, because ladies cannot be expected to be ready when men are. He asked small questions that make a web. He likes to know which corners of the day belong to which people. When did he leave?" "Just at the bell for 6, she said, glancing toward the door as if she could see the evening past it. "He had his papers in a little case that snaps." He put the case on the counter. "He borrowed my pen because he said his made him look like a schoolboy. I told him he was not wrong. Did he say where he was going?" She shook her head. "Men like him are always going, Inspector. It is their profession, to be on their way." He looked again at the blotter. Under his palm the tiny valleys were distinct now, a stubborn relief. as if a hand had pressed hard and then lifted in a hurry. He did not ask for it then. He only removed his hand and saw the faint mirror of the word he had felt. It could have said anything. It could have said pay. It could have said forgive. He did not make himself see one or the other. "You will show me the back room," he said. She led him through a curtain where the air cooled. A table with a clean square of calico for a top, a chair with a cushion that had been turned, so the thin side faced down, a hook for a coat. No pen, only a pencil worn to a polite length, a little tin box with pins and 2 buttons that had lost their partners. He ran a hand along the table edge. The wood had a dark groove where generations of hands had worried it without thinking. He liked obscurely that the place had the decency of use. Claire would sit there, Madame Canel said, not looking at him. She sat as if she were not taking space from anyone. I sometimes had to tell her not to hunch like a girl in church. Did she fear debt? "All women fear it," she said, as if he had asked whether the sky feared rain. "Those with men fear the men's debts. Those without fear their own." She did not borrow here. She did not ask for price to be eased. If I said pay Friday, she paid Friday. "That is why I gave her what work I could." He returned to the counter. The 2 customers had gone. The shop had that brief holiness of a place between transactions. He took out his card and placed it by the pen. "If Monsieur Delambre comes again, you will send word." She read his name as if tasting it. "He will not like that. He does not have to like it." She allowed herself a small smile. "No, but he will arrive with his careful shoes and his scent, and he will call me Madame twice in each sentence. He will say there is a misunderstanding. Men who write in blue are always misunderstood. Do you know where his office is?" She gestured toward the window with a tilt of her chin, the way people in their own quarter indicate distance. "Rue Saint-Maur. A door above a dry cleaner. A bell that sticks. A bookkeeper who hates coal smoke," he put on his hat. The bell on the door snipped the silence as he went out. In the street, a man with an attaché case stood under the awning opposite, pretending to rearrange his papers while watching the window. He had the stiff posture of someone who had been taught to stand correctly and found there was little else to do. When he saw he had been seen, he moved off with that careful speed that is neither flight nor saunter. Maigret did not follow. He stood under the drip from the awning, lit his pipe at last, and watched the smoke thicken and then give itself up. On the pavement near the curb, a single dark dot of ink had fallen at someone's last step and dried in the grit. He almost smiled. Paris was full of such little fossils of other people's care. He ground it with his heel and crossed toward Rue Saint-Maur. Not in pursuit, he was not a pursuing man, but because the morning had given him the shape of a door, and the door would be there whether he arrived in 10 minutes or an hour. He walked past women shaking crumbs from tablecloths, past a boy with a loaf under his arm, biting the heel with his head turned so as not to be scolded, past a dog that lifted its paw for a step and decided against it. The address Madame Canel had given him produced, as promised, a narrow door with a frosted glass pane that had been wiped by too many impatient hands. The bell stuck and then yielded with a noise like a cough. Inside, a smell of carbon paper, cheap polish, and that particular dust that lives on ledgers. A girl at a high desk was dipping her pen carefully, her blue letters marching like soldiers across a page. She looked up with that quick, guarded politeness clerks have for men who might be inspectors of one department or another. "Monsieur Delambre," Maigret said, and his voice was nothing but a voice. "He is with a client," she said, already half rising. "If you would care to—" He took off his hat and sat on the nearest chair without waiting to be offered it. He placed the hat on his knees and looked, not at the door marked private, but at the pen on the girl's desk. When she put down a line and paused, a small dot bloomed at the end of the word like a fly come to rest. He nodded to himself, not in triumph, only in recognition. The city had its own habits. He was only learning them again. He would wait. Waiting was a kind of listening. In the room beyond, a man's voice was explaining something gently, as if to a child, and a woman's voice was saying yes too often. The bell on the street door stuck again and freed itself and stuck. Somewhere faintly, he thought he could smell the after-breath of a cologne that wanted to be better than it was. The girl at the high desk bent lower over her ledger, though her eyes kept straying toward him, as if his stillness weighed on her more than any interrogation could have. Maigret sat with his hat balanced on his knees, pipe unlit, watching the patterns of dust in the light that slanted through the frosted glass. Behind the private door, the conversation carried on. A man's measured tones, a woman's voice repeating a scent like a metronome. The air smelled of paper, stale ink, and faintly beneath it, the cologne he had noticed before, a sweetness that clung too long to be respectable. At length the door opened and a lady emerged, a modest hat pulled low, her face carefully arranged not to show embarrassment. She nodded at the clerk, not at him, and hurried out, her perfume a cheap echo of the room she had left. In the doorway behind her stood a man of middle height, with neat hair parted like a ledger line, and a suit that had been pressed with more care than conviction. His case hung at his side, leather-polished thin. He blinked at the sight of Maigret, and in that blink there was the knowledge of who he must be. "Monsieur Delombre?" Maigret asked, rising slowly. The man inclined his head. "Yes, and you are—" "Maigret, police." The name was enough. It always was. He stepped into the office without invitation. Delombre's room was lined with shelves of ledgers, each identical, their backs a chorus of faded numbers. The desk was bare except for a blotter, a pen stand with 2 pens, one capped, one uncapped, and a stack of papers held down by a small brass weight shaped like a globe. The air here was thicker with ink and the faint tang of polish. Delombre gestured to the chair opposite and sat down himself with the tidy composure of a man who believed order was its own defense. "This is about Mademoiselle." "Moreau," Maigret said, Delombre's mouth pressed into what might have been intended as sorrow. "Tragic, very tragic. A fragile sort of girl. One hates to see such things. You knew her." "In passing," he said with a little shrug, "she did piecework for Madame Canil, who is a client of ours. I may have seen her there, yes." "A quiet one. We hardly spoke." Maigret let silence fall heavy as smoke. Delombre shifted once, then lifted the uncapped pen and set it down again. The nib left a tiny blot, darker than the lines beneath it. "You use blue ink," Maigret said. "As does everyone respectable," Delombre replied, a touch too quickly. "It is the standard. Did you ever lend your pen to Claire Moreau?" "Lend? No, why would I?" His hand fluttered vaguely above the desk. "She had no business with accounts." Maigret leaned back, pipe heavy in his palm. Yet a note was found beside her body, written in blue. Here in a hand not her own, a hand that pressed too firmly, as if afraid of slipping. "Do you know the look of such writing, Monsieur Delombre?" Delombre's eyes flickered just for a second to the blotter on his desk. "You are suggesting what?" "That I wrote it. For what reason? That is what I have come to ask you." The man straightened, gathering dignity about him like a cloak. "Inspector, I am a man of order. I keep accounts. I help ladies manage what their husbands squander. My life is transparent." "Transparent things still cast shadows," Maigret murmured. The door creaked and the clerk appeared, nervous, with a folder in her hands. Delombre waved her away irritably, then attempted a smile. "Forgive me." "She is new." Easily unsettled, Maigret rose and walked slowly around the desk. On a side table lay a case snapped shut. He placed his hand on it. "This yours?" "Yes, my work papers. Receipts." "Among other things. Written in blue?" Delombre swallowed. Naturally. Maigret opened the case without asking. Inside were neat sheaves, columns of figures, and among them a slip of paper folded once. He drew it out. The writing on it was careful, schoolish, the same hand that had shaped the note beside Claire's bed. "Forgive the delay. Pay Friday." The last word carried the little dot at its end, darker than the line before it. Delombre reached forward too quickly. "That is nothing." "A memorandum. I often write notes to myself, and sometimes for others," Maigret asked. The man's face stiffened, then relaxed into an approximation of calm. "Inspector, this is an unfortunate coincidence. You cannot build a case on ink and paper. Many men write carefully." Maigret tucked the slip into his pocket. "It is not the ink. It is the silence that follows it. A silence in which neighbors hear water running, shoes that are too clean, and a cough in a corridor. Tell me, Monsieur Delombre, why would you place a note beside a woman's bed if not to make her death seem something it was not?" For the first time, Delombre's composure wavered. His fingers tightened on the pen until the nib squeaked against the blotter. "You have no proof." "I have time," Maigret said simply. "And time has a way of drawing words from people who thought they had hidden them." He left then, without raising his voice or his pace, only nodding to the clerk as he passed. In the street the air was damp again, the promise of more rain. He lit his pipe and let the smoke curl, thinking of the slip of paper in his pocket, the blue letters trying too hard to be neat. He thought of Claire Moreau, who wrote in pencil because ink smudged, and of a man who pressed too hard on the nib because his hand was not steady with lies. The case was not finished. It had only begun to reveal its shape. But the shape was human enough: loneliness, debt, pride, and the little deceits that grow into larger ones. As he walked toward the Quai des Orfèvres, the city seemed to lean in around him, the rain on the cobbles making mirrors of the streets, as if Paris itself were watching to see how he would turn the page. He walked back to the quay with the slip in his pocket and the smell of that officious cologne in his nose, sat a while at his desk without taking off his coat, and watched the damp creep again along the window. The office was warmer than the streets, but held the same tired light. Lognon materialized in the doorway, with his coat collar turned up as if he were refusing the day entry. I saw him, Lognon said, not so much asking as resigning. The clerk. Maigret nodded, drew the folded paper from his pocket, put it under the blotter, and then after a moment took it out again. He writes in a schoolboy's hand and presses too hard. He is tidy enough to kill tidily if he must. Lognon rubbed his nose with 2 fingers. The doctor we had up there is certain of sleeping pills. He says between 9 and midnight is not a foolish guess. He says you do not need me to say that the magistrate will complain if you make a suicide into a murder without a wound to point at. I will give him a wound he can live with, Maigret said mildly. For the moment, go to Madame Canel and take her blotter, the whole thing, not a sympathy. Tell her to fetch a new one from a stationer and lament the price. Do not explain. Hand send Janvier to Chemin Vert again, to sit in the lodge and listen to the stairs until night. It is a house that prefers to speak when it thinks no one is listening. He rose heavy and put on his hat. He didn't tell Lognon he meant to go back to the room and sit there himself for an hour. He didn't need to tell him. There are habits men carry like their faces. The house was different by afternoon, which is to say it was the same in another key. The wet laundry in the courtyard now had a skin of chill that made it less like cloth and more like flags announcing the time of day. Madame Borel had gone out for onions and left the lodge to a taste of empty. Janvier had taken up a position on a chair and nodded at him with the solemnity of a man at a wake. On the 3rd floor the hallway smelled faintly of boiled sugar, the kind of sweet that comes from nothing in particular. He opened the door to Claire Moreau's room and did what he always did in rooms that had finished their living. He did nothing. He sat and let the silence find its voice down in his bones. After a time, he heard the faintest ticking of the alarm clock by the bed. He had not noticed its sound before because all the other sounds had been loud. He stood and went to the washstand. The basin was clean in the way a thing is when someone has cleaned, without knowing where to stop. Too bright around the plug, dull along the sides. He bent, sniffed, and caught a ghost of the cologne that fancied itself better than it was. He closed his eyes a second, then turned the tap on and off to hear the way the pipes answered. The sound would carry easily to the 2nd floor. He knelt and looked at the floorboards beside the table. The scrub had raised the grain. In the low light, he could see a pale, unfussy oval where a rag had been moved in circles. At the table's edge, just where he had noticed the little comet of blue, a fainter smear ran a finger's length toward the leg, then stopped. He put his thumb on it. The stain had dried to a roughness that caught the swirl of his skin. Whoever had written here had not wiped well. He lifted the note and held it to the window. The light showed nothing new, but his palm felt the slight polish of the paper, as if it had been smoothed before being placed. The corridor gave him footsteps. He didn't turn at once. Vacheron, the post office man, appeared in the door with his hat in his hands as if he had come to a confession. He peered at the table and then at Maigret's face and decided to look at his shoes instead. I did not want to disturb the concierge, he said, whispering without need. I have a late shift. I wanted to tell you last night it was not only water. There was a smell in the corridor. Not smoke. I thought church, but it is not incense. It is that scent men put on when they think ladies will be there to smell. I am not making poetry. I mean the kind that leaves itself on the stair. Maigret nodded. What time? Earlier than I said, Vacheron admitted, eager to be faithful now he had decided to speak. I named 11 because it is the number that comes into a man's mouth when he does not look at a clock. It was after the evening news on the radio from my room, between the news and the dance music. Then later there was a cough, a boy's cough, and the water. It might be 2 men you need, not 1. Thank you, Maigret said, and meant it. He watched Vacheron's blue-rimmed fingernail, as the man fidgeted with his hat and thought of the clerk's nib making a little fly at the end of a word. Chabot from the back room drifted, passed to fetch coal and lingered like a curtain in a draught. I remembered a detail, he offered shyly. A door closed twice last night, once with respect and once with a hurry. The respectful one was before the music. The other was after the music. I do not know if doors can tell character, Inspector, but some nights they try. When they had gone, the room settled again. The doctor's window of time slid into place with what he was being told. A careful man earlier, a boy later. It did not comfort him, not because it left André less shadowed, but because it made the careful man clearer. On the table under the note lay Claire's comb, its teeth missing 3 in a row. He had not noticed it before because it did not want to be noticed. He lifted it, turned it in his hand, and then put it back where it had been. On the wardrobe floor the shoebox had shifted a thumb's width, perhaps when Janvier or the boy from the commissariat had stood there with tired feet. He slid it open again. Ribbon, postcard paper. Beneath the paper another scrap had found a way to hide. He worked it free with a fingernail. It was a corner torn from one of those small notepad shops kept by the till. Blue lines sat faint as a bleached shirt. The word Friday had been written, and then crossed with a pencil stroke that pressed hard enough to shine. The hand that made the word had tried to be neat. The hand that crossed it had not. He put the scrap in his wallet and closed the box as if he might wake something. He stood a minute with his hand on the wardrobe door, and then left the room as he had found it, only with the light turned off, so that his eyes could stop the habit of looking for things. Downstairs, Janvier had taken out a newspaper he did not read. Lognon sent a boy, he said. He has the blotter wrapped like fish. He will bring it to the quay. Good. Maigret stood with his coat open and allowed the damp to enter him, then fastened it again. When I am gone, if the clerk comes to look, do not stop him. Only notice how he looks. Which clerk? The one with clean shoes and a smell that acts better than he does. The air outside had that tired iron taste again. He walked back not directly to the quay, but along a street that had a chemist at its corner, where the windows showed glass jars with colored water, like mockeries of medicine. He went in. The man behind the counter had the complacency of someone who knows the price of everything in his drawers. Simenon, Maigret said, as if ordering the weather. In the last week, to a woman from Rue du Chemin Vert, quiet, thin, pays in coins. The chemist pursed his mouth, pretended to ransack, then allowed himself the small pleasure of remembering. 2 days ago, a gentleman asked for it. Said his wife could not sleep. Good manners, a small case. I did not ask for a prescription, Inspector. One does not like to trouble a gentleman. He spread his fingers, chastened and unchastened, blue ink on his fingers. The chemist considered. A careful man does not dip his fingers, but does he smell like the inside of a hat shop? A reluctant grin. That one did. He left with the ledger entry written in the chemist's own painstaking blue. Date, quantity, price, the smallest justification a man can give himself. He did not need the paper. He took it to let the chemist keep his own story of the day he had not asked a question. At the quay, the blotter lay on his desk wrapped in newspaper, the paper leaving a faint pattern of yesterday's headline on the muslin. He unrolled it. The surface was a garden of endings, blue words cut off by patience. He laid a sheet of thin paper across it and rubbed gently with the side of a pencil, like a schoolboy making a gravestone speak. Letters came up from beneath as if embarrassed to be seen. Pay Friday, Madame V, buttons for. The last one did not know if it wanted to be for or forgive. The G began its loop and then stopped, as if the hand had thought better of it. He breathed out and the thin paper lifted at the corner. Enough. He was not a man to be pleased by cleverness, only by the shape of things becoming the things they were. He telephoned Rue Saint-Maur and told the clerk to ask Monsieur de Lombre to come to the quay at 6 to clarify a receipt. The girl's voice on the line made itself dry with importance. She would deliver the summons with relish. He rang off and stood a while looking at the city's light flatten on the river. Then he put on his coat again for the last errand of the day. He did not go to fetch Delambre. He went instead to stop briefly at the Rue du Chemin Vert. He climbed to the third floor and stood in the corridor outside the quiet door. He did not open it. He looked at the floorboards, at the paling scrubbed oval where a rag had gone in circles, at the place where water once pushed under the door like a shy tongue. He stood until a neighbor opened a door, saw him, nodded, shut it again without asking. People are kind in this way when they want the law to think well of their houses, At 6, when Delambre arrived at the quay with his neat case and his face ironed flat, Maigret had the chemist's blue entry on his blotter, the scrap from the shoebox in his wallet, the rubbed word on the thin paper under his hand, and the smell of a dishonest scent still in his coat. He did not arrange them like evidence. He let them lie like the ordinary objects they were. He fixed Delambre with the sort of patient gaze that makes a man determine his own guilt in the silence, and said simply, "You will take me through your Thursday, from 5 o'clock to midnight, and you will leave nothing out, not the lighting of a cigarette nor the sound of a bell." Delambre opened his case, perhaps to guard himself with papers, and found there was nothing among them to hide behind. He set his pen on the blotter, and it made at once a small dark dot. Delambre's account began smoothly, like one of his ledgers read aloud. At 5 he was at Madame Quesnel's. At 6 he left carrying his case. At 7 a meeting at the Rue Saint-Maur office. At 9 a client. At midnight, home, each hour placed, each movement carefully folded as if to make a shirt neat enough for inspection. Maigret listened without a sound, only nodding once in a while, letting the man believe his recital was complete armor. When Delambre finished, Maigret opened a drawer and laid out the small things one by one. Not evidence in the courtroom sense, but ordinary objects with the weight of truth in them. The scrap from Claire's shoebox with Friday in a hand, not hers. The chemist's ledger entry for Veronal purchased by a gentleman with a case. The rubbing from Madame Quesnel's blotter, showing the half-born word forgive, and finally the note itself. Precise, schoolish, the last line pooling into a dark dot where the pen had paused too long. Delambre's eyes clung to the note, then flickered to the scrap with its hard pencil line crossing out the same word. His lips parted as if to explain, but no sound came. "You pressed too hard," Maigret said quietly. "On the nib, on the paper, on yourself. A woman who writes in pencil would never leave such a neat farewell. But you could not resist order. Even in death you wanted her tidy." Delambre swallowed. His hands, neat clerk's hands, smoothed the crease of his trousers, though they shook. "She owed me nothing," he said at last, his voice thin. "It was not about money. She was decent, too decent. She would not—" He stopped, then forced the words through clenched teeth. "She would not be kept. And so you thought to keep her in another way," Maigret said. "With a note, a story no one would question. A quiet girl, a small room, sleeping pills. No bruises, no scene. Only blue words left in place of her silence. The cologne clung to him even now, too sweet, too insistent, filling the room like a protest." He put his face in his hands, and in the muffled space between his palms his voice came breaking. "She looked at me as if I were a shadow. I could have given her security, respect, everything. She would not look back. She smiled once, but it was not for me. Do you know what that is, Inspector? To be invisible?" Maigret did not answer. He knew too well that people were broken less by hatred than by being unseen. He let the silence settle, thick and inevitable, until Delambre's breathing grew ragged. When the guards came to lead him away, Delambre followed without protest, carrying only his case, still polished thin. On the blotter, the pen he had left behind made another dot, darker than the others. Later at home, Louise set the table as if nothing had shifted in the world. She poured him wine and asked whether the day had been long. He said only, "Long enough," and ate slowly, the warmth of the pot-au-feu filling the quiet. After, he sat by the window with his pipe, the rain tapping against the glass. He thought of Claire Moreau, her shoes polished for a walk she never took, her lists in pencil folded under sugar tins, her silence deeper than any note could disguise. He thought of André Lemoine, who would carry parcels with his too eager hands, and of Madame Deslaux, who insisted order was a kind of protection. The city outside glistened with its usual damp indifference. Another case would come, another quiet tragedy hidden under ordinary days. But for now he drew on his pipe, watching the smoke curl and fade, and let the weight of human loneliness sit with him, heavy and familiar, like an old coat he would never quite take off. And when Louise touched his shoulder on her way to bed, he covered her hand with his own and held it there a moment longer than usual, as if to remind himself that some silences need no blue ink to make them true.